This week, as I typically do, I was sitting at the dinner table with Bala and telling him about my Sunday message and what I was thinking of saying. And as typically happens, Izzy, our 5-year-old daughter, started asking questions and basically wanted it to be explained in terms she understood. This Sunday is the passage on the disciple Thomas. And I told her how Jesus allowed Thomas to touch the wounds in his hands and in his side. And Izzy's reaction was priceless. She said, "Mom, that is disgusting. You should definitely not talk about that in your message." And honestly, she's right. It is a little gross. But many of us don't think of it as disgusting because we're so familiar with this passage that we've normalized and sterilized this passage. I had a familiar feeling last week during our Easter message. When we think of Easter, most years we think of Easter lilies and the organ pumping out triumphantly, or people in their Easter best and extravagant meals. We sanitize and normalize the idea that a man was killed a brutal death, now lives. We sanitize and normalize the mixed emotions the disciples who were at the same time both afraid and yet hopeful. Yet, this year, it doesn't feel normal or sanitized. It feels familiar. I'm not the first pastor, nor will I be the last to point out that the disciple Thomas got a raw deal. The whole thing feels unfair when you read it. In this morning's passage, the disciples are in a locked room and they have heard the testimony of Mary, who saw Jesus and heard Jesus, and 2 of the disciples had seen the empty tomb. The passage says that they were afraid, but I'm sure they also felt a strange hope in the midst of their fear. And in that strange swirl of emotions, Jesus appears to them. Jesus breathes peace onto them and sends them out for a ministry of forgiveness. Thomas just happened not to be there at the time. The disciples all tell Thomas what they saw, but Thomas is honest and frank and knows what it's going to take for him to believe. It's going to take exactly what the other disciples saw and experienced. You see, Thomas wanted what everyone else got, Jesus' physical presence. Why then is Thomas called Doubting Thomas for all of history? Just because he wanted what everyone else got? That doesn't seem fair. There's a lot that doesn't feel fair in these times. Some people are out of work, while others are working double and triple shifts or working 2 jobs at the same time. People who need life-giving procedures are suddenly deemed elective procedures and have to wait. Children who should be in school with friends and trained teachers are having to learn from a home in suboptimum environments. I appreciate Adam Sandler who's saying, "I am teaching my son math. That can't be good for America." Or my heart goes out to the class of 2020 who are missing out on prom and other important moments with their graduating class. As a sign of accompaniment, many on social media have been posting their senior picture with loving messages of thoughts and prayers for the senior class of 2020. You all, I feel sad for the class of 2020, but not enough to post my senior picture for all to see. I'm sorry, it is just too corny. And I didn't even graduate in the 1980s when it's most embarrassing. I just had poor style choices. But all joking aside, this stinks. This is unfair. And probably the most painful of all is how this whole thing has separated families. Grandparents can't hug and kiss their grandkids. Even nuclear families are having to be separated. If somebody's in the medical field or police or firemen, they have to separate in their own homes. Or how about when someone gets sick and has to go to the hospital and can't have their loved ones with them by their side? That doesn't feel fair. And it probably goes more than just feeling unfair. It hurts. All this unfairness makes me feel afraid and frustrated, sad and angry. In a time of uncertainty, it's easy to become preoccupied with the unfairness happening in our world today. One could allow that anger and that outrage to rule the day and rule our lives. And as I feel the frustration and anger rise up in me, I think of what I tell Izzy when she's about to throw a tantrum. You are allowed to feel your feelings, but it is what you do with your feelings that counts. For example, you can stomp or scream into a pillow, but you can't throw things or hit people. We are allowed to feel frustrated and sad. I'm sure Thomas felt frustrated and sad that he didn't get what the other disciples got. So he asked God to do what he knew God was capable of doing, to show up, to be with him in body. His demand wasn't an act of doubt, it was an act of faith. Thomas' faith was so bold that he knew he could ask God for God's presence in a time of uncertainty and fear. In this way, when we see the unfairness and when we are frustrated, we know we can take that outrage to God, and God will not just hear us, God will show up. I'm not saying if we just have faith, the unfairness will go away. But I'm saying if we have the eyes of faith, we can see God is working even in this. Similarly, but not the same, there's also another unfairness happening as well, and that is grace. By no means does this make all the injustice that is happening in the world okay. Perhaps, though, when we focus on the beauty and joy and grace in the world, it makes it easier for us to navigate the unfairness we all are experiencing right now. This thought came to me the other night when I was changing my baby Indy into her pajamas before bed. Now Indy gets silly and giggly right before bed. And as many of you know, the giggles of a 1-year-old are pretty much, in my opinion, some of the most glorious, joyful, grace-filled sounds this world has to offer. I don't think I am or any of us are worthy of that experience of such pure joy. But yet there it is, in all its unfairness. Thomas experienced with physical touch God's grace. How are you sensing God's grace right now? What does God's grace smell like? Maybe it's the sweetness of blooming flowers or the stinging scent of donated hand sanitizer. What does grace look like? Maybe it's the message of hope written in chalk along our sidewalks, or the smiling faces of people you love on a video conference. What does grace sound like? Maybe it's the sound of a neighbor who's a nurse starting their car to go to work. Or the hum of sewing machines as many give of their time and talents to sew masks for their neighbors. What does grace taste like? Is it the memory of that bread and wine shared at the communion table? Or a meal delivered at your footsteps by a neighbor? How are you experiencing God's presence through the senses of your body? While I have been discouraged by the injustice and unfairness of this time, I have also been astounded by people's willingness to show up for one another and God's ability to break through and shine hope into the darkest of places. Jesus enters that locked room and sends a word of peace and breathes on his disciples. Jesus's breath reflects back to the creation story when God breathes into the original couple life. Jesus is breathing life and peace. Peace be with you. Breathing a word of life. There is a frustrating amount of unfairness at this time, and we are justifiably angry. Even as we cry out to God and demand God to show up, we can see the undeniable presence of God's grace and love. We can witness to those who are being the hands and the feet of God. Do you hear that? Do you see that? Do you taste that? Do you feel that? Peace. Peace be with you. Again, I say peace. Amen.